The civil rights movement in the United States, spanning primarily from the mid-20th century, represents a monumental and transformative period in the nation's history. This tumultuous era, marked by heroic acts of resistance, pivotal legislative achievements, and searing cultural shifts, sought to dismantle the deep-rooted systems of racial segregation and discrimination. Central figures emerged, strategies were devised, and the battle for equality intersected with other global rights movements, leaving an indelible mark on American society. Historical context: prior to the 1950s, racial segregation, particularly in the southern states, was deeply institutionalized. While slavery had been abolished almost a century earlier, the grip of racial injustice held firm, culminating in a society where African Americans were systematically denied their fundamental rights. Rosa Parks' refusal and the Montgomery bus boycott, 1955 to 1956. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks, a black seamstress, refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. This act of defiance led to the Montgomery bus boycott, a 381-day protest against racial segregation on public transportation. This successful campaign, which resulted in the U.S. Supreme Court ruling to desegregate buses in Montgomery, symbolized the power of collective nonviolent resistance. Rosa Parks' act of civil disobedience was not just a spur-of-the-moment decision. Parks was a seasoned activist, having served as the secretary of the local NAACP chapter. Her refusal was a spark that lit the flame of the Montgomery bus boycott. Black leaders, including a young Martin Luther King Jr., mobilized Montgomery's black community to boycott the city's public buses. The boycott showcased the economic power of black unity, and its success became a beacon for other nonviolent protests throughout the South. Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership and I Have a Dream speech, 1963. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist minister, emerged as a central figure in the civil rights movement. His advocacy for nonviolent protest was pivotal. On August 28, 1963, during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, King delivered his iconic I Have a Dream speech, envisioning a future where people would be judged by their character rather than skin color. Dr. King wasn't just a preacher, he was a strategic thinker and organizer. His leadership in the Montgomery bus boycott propelled him into the national spotlight. By the time he gave his I Have a Dream speech in Washington, he had already faced multiple arrests and had navigated the challenges of leadership within the civil rights movement. His speech is often remembered for its poetic vision, but it was also a call to action against the harsh realities of racism. Civil rights marches, protests, and legislative achievements. The 1960s witnessed major protests, like the Birmingham Campaign, 1963, and the Selma to Montgomery marches, 1965. These events, sometimes met with violent repression, led to significant legislative changes, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex or national origin, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, eliminating racial barriers to voting. Events like the Birmingham Campaign highlighted the stark violence black protesters faced, with images of children being sprayed with high-pressure water hoses shocking the nation. The Selma to Montgomery marches were pivotal, bringing attention to voter suppression and culminating in the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These achievements did not come easily, they were the result of strategy, sacrifice, and perseverance by countless activists. Malcolm X's advocacy, and the Black Power movement. While Martin Luther King Jr. championed nonviolent resistance, Malcolm X, a prominent figure in the Nation of Islam, initially advocated for racial separatism and later, after his pilgrimage to Mecca, for black empowerment and unity. His ideas laid the foundation for the Black Power movement, which emerged in the late 1960s, emphasizing racial pride, economic empowerment, and the creation of political and cultural institutions for black people. Malcolm X's critiques of both American society and the mainstream civil rights movement compelled many to consider more radical forms of protest. His transformation after his pilgrimage to Mecca showcased his evolving understanding of race and unity. His assassination in 1965 was a crushing blow, but his ideas lived on, profoundly influencing groups like the Black Panther Party. Broader impacts on women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and other civil rights movements. The strategies and successes of the civil rights movement became a blueprint for other rights movements. The women's liberation movement, the gay rights movement, highlighted by events such as the Stonewall riots in 1969, and movements for Latino and Asian American rights, among others, took inspiration from the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement did not exist in a vacuum. It intersected with various other struggles. Leaders like Diane Nash and Ella Baker were not just civil rights activists but also champions for women's rights. Similarly, the tactics and successes of the civil rights movement informed and inspired LGBTQ+ rights activists during events like the Stonewall riots. Role of students and the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Young activists played an essential role in the civil rights movement. In 1960, after a series of sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, the SNCC was founded, playing a pivotal role in freedom rides and voter registration drives. College students became a formidable force in the civil rights movement. The SNCC not only organized sit-ins but also spearheaded initiatives like Freedom Summer in 1964, which aimed to register black voters in Mississippi. Their youth and radicalism often brought them into tension with older civil rights leaders, showcasing the diversity of thought and tactics within the broader movement. Opposition and violent backlash. The civil rights movement faced immense opposition, often violent. The murder of activists like Medgar Evers, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham that killed 4 young girls, and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 highlighted the severe resistance the movement encountered. It's crucial to understand that the civil rights movement faced not only institutional opposition but also violent, grassroots resistance from white supremacists. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities and activists. State and local governments often tacitly, or openly, supported such actions, making the struggle for rights perilous. Influence on music, art, and popular culture. Artists like Nina Simone, Sam Cooke, and James Brown produced music influenced by and influential to the movement. Visual arts and literature also became platforms to express, inspire, and chronicle the struggle for civil rights. The civil rights movement was not only a political and social revolution but a cultural one as well. Songs like Sam Cooke's "A Change Is Gonna Come" captured the zeitgeist of the period. Authors like James Baldwin critiqued American racism, while visual artists like Romare Bearden celebrated black culture and history. The civil rights movement was a transformative period in U.S. history, challenging and changing the deep-seated racial inequalities embedded in American society. Its impact resonated not just in the realm of racial justice, but also inspired and intersected with various other rights movements, emphasizing the interconnectedness of the struggle for equality. Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, a landmark decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, which declared state laws establishing separate public schools for black and white students unconstitutional. This ruling paved the way for integration and the civil rights movement. This was a culmination of years of legal strategy by the NAACP and its lead lawyer, Thurgood Marshall, who would later become the first African American Supreme Court justice. The case overturned the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy v. Ferguson, acknowledging the deep psychological damage segregation caused to black children. Freedom rides, 1961, civil rights activists boarded interstate buses in the South to challenge the non-enforcement of the U.S. Supreme Court decisions which had ruled segregated public buses unconstitutional. Despite facing violence, the freedom rides led to the enforcement of desegregation laws on interstate transportation. These weren't just about desegregation of transportation. They aimed to challenge the complacency of the federal government regarding Southern defiance of Supreme Court rulings. James Meredith and the University of Mississippi, 1962, James Meredith became the first African American student admitted to the segregated University of Mississippi after intervention from federal authorities, signaling a challenge to educational segregation. Meredith's enrollment was a direct challenge to the deep-seated traditions of white supremacy in the South, especially in educational institutions which had been bastions of segregation. Little Rock 9, 1957, a group of 9 black students enrolled at formerly all-white Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, and were initially prevented from entering the school. President Dwight D. Eisenhower had to send in federal troops to ensure their safety and entrance. The image of young black students being escorted into a school by federal troops highlighted the depth of resistance to integration. It underscored the federal government's responsibility in enforcing civil rights laws, often in opposition to state governments. The role of churches and faith leaders. Black churches played a vital role in the civil rights movement. They were places of support, community organizing, and spiritual inspiration. Leaders like Ralph Abernathy and F.T. Reese, among others, highlighted the intersection of faith and activism. The black church served as a sanctuary, a place of political organization, and a moral compass. Sermons and church meetings often intertwined with civil rights strategy sessions. Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act, it was enacted as a follow-up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, or sex. This was a response not only to the ongoing civil rights movement, but also to the urban uprisings often mislabeled as riots, that occurred in numerous cities after the assassination of Dr. King in 1968. The act sought to address some of the structural issues related to housing discrimination. Black Panthers, founded in 1966, the Black Panther Party was a revolutionary socialist organization active in the U.S. from 1966 until 1982. They aimed to address systemic issues of racial injustice and police brutality. The Black Panthers also provided social services like free breakfast for children. They were not just about self-defense, they had community programs like free breakfasts for children and health clinics. Their emphasis on black empowerment, socialism, and community programs showcased a more radical vision of civil rights and black autonomy. Role of the press and media. The civil rights movement was one of the first major movements to be televised. Images of peaceful protesters being attacked by dogs and hoses or beaten by police officers were broadcast into living rooms, arousing public opinion nationwide. This was a double-edged sword. While media brought attention to the brutal repression faced by protesters, it also often portrayed them in reductive or negative terms, influencing public perception. Affirmative action. As a follow-up to civil rights reforms, affirmative action policies were introduced to help ensure that minorities and women had more equal opportunities in education and employment. Rooted in executive orders from the 1960s, affirmative action was an acknowledgement of the institutional, systemic nature of racism, recognizing that past injustices had present-day implications. From bus boycotts to Supreme Court decisions, from nonviolent marches to radical advocacy, the civil rights movement was an era of seismic change, challenging and transforming the very fabric of American society. Through pain, perseverance, and resilience, the movement became a testament to the enduring struggle for justice and equality.